Today, we're really immersing ourselves in, well, the mechanics of control after independence, after the flags go up. Our listener, you're likely interested in decolonial thought, anti-colonial ideas, and maybe need that faster track to understanding how economic and political chains didn't really break, they just changed shape.
Right. They morphed.
So this is aimed at getting you informed quickly on those post-independence power structures.
And our focus, our mission, if you like, is to really dissect this idea of neo-colonialism. We're leaning heavily on a foundational text here, Kwame Nkrumah's 1965 analysis, Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism.
A really seminal work.
Absolutely. It's incredibly detailed, almost forensic, in how it examines imperialism adapting once direct political rule wasn't really an option anymore.
And the core argument, the thesis, is pretty sobering, isn't it? Nkrumah didn't just see this as a continuation. He called it the final and perhaps its most dangerous stage of imperialism.
Exactly. Dangerous because it maintains that crushing economic and financial grip, but without the visible boots-on-the-ground administrative hassle of direct rule.
Which makes it harder to spot, right? And definitely harder to unite against.
Definitely. And it's fascinating how the source links this not just to finance, but to the survival strategy of monopoly capitalism itself. It references an observation from Lenin that imperialism leads to the complete conversion of all the possessing classes to imperialism. They become passionate defenders of the system.
While hiding its true nature.
Precisely. Constantly camouflaging the exploitation.
So the goal for these ruling classes isn't just taking resources, it's maintaining a whole global setup that masks the hidden economic machinery running underneath the surface of supposed freedom, which I think sets us up perfectly for our first big theme, defining this new, more subtle face of imperialism.
Okay, so let's pin down neocolonialism. The source defines it as control over a state that is, on paper, independent, nominally independent.
But the control itself is flexible.
Very. It's often the old colonial power, sure, but not always. Think South Vietnam France was the formal colonizer, but the real economic and political clout shifted pretty decisively to the United States.
Right, okay. And sometimes it's not even a single state pulling the strings. You mentioned
Right.
the Congo earlier.
Exactly. The source highlights cases like the Congo, where control is exercised by a consortium. International financial interests, big cartels, acting sometimes even outside the specific policy aims of any single government.
Wow, okay. So how do they secure this control over policy? The analysis breaks it down, right? 3 main pillars.
Yes, 3 key pillars, really vital to grasp if you're studying this. First, payments towards the actual cost of running the state. Call it aid, call it subsidies.
But it buys leverage.
Immediate leverage over budgets, yes. Second, providing civil servants, placing them in key decision-making spots, especially finance and trade, where they can dictate or, subtly steer policy.
And the third one, this feels like the clincher, monetary control.
Absolutely. Controlling foreign exchange through a banking system that's ultimately controlled by the imperial power or its financial network.
If you control how a nation trades internationally, its currency, the people implementing policy, you don't really need a governor anymore, do you?
You really don't.
Huh.
The flag ceremony becomes just that, a ceremony.
So this system, it leads somewhere specific. It creates non-viable states.
That's the central outcome described. The defining mark of a state caught in neocolonialism is that it is fundamentally not the master of its own destiny.
And the danger isn't just economic stagnation. The source links this non-viability to conflict.
A severe threat to world peace, yes. It's framed as the breeding ground for limited wars. Since nuclear weapons deter all-out global war between the superpowers,
Right.
these smaller localized conflicts become the way imperial powers jostle for regional dominance without risking Armageddon. Proxy wars, essentially.
And how do you ensure these states remain non-viable breeding grounds?
The core strategy identified is breaking up large, united colonial territories into small, weak states. Balkanization.
Balkanization.
If these new nations, particularly in Africa, had been allowed to emerge as large, unified blocs, think United States of Africa, they'd have had the scale, the internal markets, the resources for independent development.
But by fragmenting them.
They become structurally unable to support industrialization. Their markets are too small, they're forced into dependency.
It's divide and rule, but with an economic twist.
Precisely. And this connects back, interestingly, to how capitalist states manage their own internal problems. There was a shift in exporting social conflict.
Okay, explain that. Before World War II, colonies were mostly about raw materials and markets, right? Profits went to the top tier back home.
Right, which led to class conflict in the imperial countries, organized labor movements, and also fueled liberation movements abroad. Big problems.
So after WWII, the strategy changed.
There was a conscious shift, according to the analysis. Instead of just enriching the elite, colonial earnings were deliberately channeled to help finance the emerging welfare state in places like Britain and France.
So using colonial wealth to buy social peace at home.
Exactly. To manage domestic class conflict, maintain political stability. It's a huge point. By doing this, they essentially exported the social conflicts of the capitalist countries.
Wow. So the conflict between rich and poor didn't disappear.
It just moved from the national stage to the international stage.
Which explains why some analysts started talking about an international class war. The core conflict wasn't just within nations anymore, but between the rich have nations and the poor have not nations.
Precisely. And this transfer helps explain why aid often feels so ineffective or even counterproductive. The developed powers, having built their own domestic calm, partly on this imbalance,
have a built-in interest in maintaining that imbalance.
They have a structural interest in keeping the developing world, well, developing, or rather underdeveloped. Neo-Colonialism is the tool that maintains that gap. So appeals based on goodwill or generosity. They miss the structural point entirely.
Which brings us right up against that huge paradox. Africa, a continent bursting with natural wealth, yet its people remain systematically impoverished. It's almost unbelievable.
The source really hammers home the scale of Africa's untapped potential. Just look at hydropower. Africa has over 40% of the world's potential water power.
40%. And how much is actually used?
Less than 5%. Because the control over development over infrastructure isn't local.
And minerals.
It holds 53 of the world's most important industrial minerals and metals, the absolute building blocks of modern industry. Yet the continent accounts for just 2% of global production.
2%. That disparity tells the story, doesn't it? The wealth flows out.
Overwhelmingly, it enriches outside interests.
And the source gives some stark examples of this dependency, right, from the late 50s.
Yeah, really specific data. Britain's, for instance, getting 80% of its manganese from Africa, 82% of its cobalt, 2/3 of its asbestos.
Vital industrial inputs.
Absolutely. And France was even more tied in, 100% of its phosphates, 85% of lead ore, nearly 1/3 of its cotton, all from its former African colonies.
But here's the kicker. The real paradox made concrete.
Not one single newly independent African country at the time of the analysis had developed an integrated industry based on any of these resources they were exporting.
So they dig it up, ship it out, and buy back finished goods made from their own materials.
That's the pattern. Raw material extraction is a priority. Value-added manufacturing, the kind that builds real wealth and skills locally, is structurally prevented.
It guarantees this. Economic maladjustment. You mentioned Nigeria in 1960.
Right. The figures are telling. Agriculture and primary extraction, 63% of the economy. Industry and manufacturing, a tiny 2%.
Compare that to the U.S. or Europe.
Exactly. In developed economies, that primary sector might be small, maybe less than 10%, but it supports a huge industrial and service superstructure. In Nigeria, that ratio just confirmed, as the source puts it, a total disregard under colonialism of Nigeria's potentialities.
And underpinning this disregard, enabling the super profits, is the wage gap.
Oh, it's brutal. The comparison given is shocking. U.S. miners earning about $2.70 an hour back then. African miners in South Africa digging up the same gold, the same copper.
How much?
Less than 10 cents an hour.
10 cents. That's a 27-to-1 difference for the same work.
That difference is the super profit. It's the fuel for finance capital. And to keep that structure locked in place, balkanization, still the main tool.
Because small states can't build big industries.
Their internal markets are too small to justify the investment, so they're stuck. Sell raw stuff cheap, buy finished goods dear. It's an economic cage.
And French policy gives us a really clear example of how this was done deliberately. The Loi Cadre of 1956. Can we unpack that a bit? It sounds technical, but the impact was huge.
It was huge. The Loi Cadre, the outline law, was specifically designed legislation. Its purpose was to dismantle the large existing administrative federations, French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa.
Which had been run as bigger, more centralized units before?
Exactly. They had relatively powerful federal administrations. The Loi Cadre smashed them into dozens of small, separate territories, individual states.
So it wasn't just about redrawing maps, it was about breaking political power, preventing a strong, unified challenge to Paris.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Decentralizing power down to these tiny units ensured each one was weak, fiscally dependent, too small to really go it alone. They were then basically forced to maintain links, military, financial, economic, with France just to cover their basic running costs.
Except for Guinea.
Guinea was the exception. Voted no to the new French Community Constitution, cut ties completely. But the source is clear: the price was immense hardship, great suffering and losses.
And for the others, this dependence meant relying on French aid, which, as we've established, wasn't really aid.
No, it mainly benefited French companies by guaranteeing them protected markets. The African states had to buy fixed amounts of French goods, often things France had a surplus of, like textiles or sugar, sometimes at uncompetitive prices.
And they couldn't easily buy cheaper goods from elsewhere.
They had to severely limit imports from outside the franc zone. It locked them into France's economic orbit.
Which brings us neatly to the monetary control aspect, the franc zone itself. This sounds like the ultimate trap.
It really was. While a few countries like Mali tried to break away for a while, most had their currencies tied directly to the French franc at a fixed rate, backed by the French treasury.
Okay, a guarantee sounds good on the surface, protects against instability. But what was the catch? The cost to sovereignty.
The cost was giving up financial autonomy. Under this system, all the foreign currency these African states earned, the dollars, the pounds from selling their commodities on the world market, went into pooled accounts called operations accounts held in the French treasury in Paris.
So France held their reserves.
Essentially, yes. They could technically overdraw these accounts, but the critical point is their entire international financial standing was subject to French oversight and ultimately French control.
So Paris could basically turn off the tap, like they did with Guinea.
Precisely. When Guinea created its own currency and left the system, the source notes its operations account in Paris was immediately blocked. A very clear message. Assert monetary independence, and we can cripple your ability to trade internationally overnight.
And here's where it gets even more complex, connecting back to that idea of a superstate. The source points out something fascinating. Sometimes these African countries in the franc zone acted politically almost like U.S. client states, even when France itself was taking an opposing line. Like, France might recognize China or oppose U.S. actions in Latin America, but these African states wouldn't necessarily follow France's lead.
Yes, and the analysis suggests why. The powerful French banks controlling the financial levers for these African states were themselves subject to influence from even bigger international financial players, or often U.S.-dominated ones.
So there's another layer of control above the nominal neo-colonial power.
Exactly. It points to the existence of a superstate of international finance, a network of global capital.
Meaning the real shots are sometimes called even deeper within the global financial system. This superstate could potentially override even what France, the supposed master, wanted politically.
That's the implication. And for anyone trying to understand decoloniality, grasping this layered, often non-state, diffused nature of control, that it's not just one government pulling strings, but vast financial networks, it's absolutely critical.
Okay, this idea of a diffuse superstate leads us straight into the web of global finance. We need to talk about finance capital.
Right. The source emphasizes this term, the merging of bank capital and industrial capital. It's not just banks lending money, it's banks deeply intertwined with, owning, controlling huge industrial operations. This creates these giant pyramidal monopolies that dominate world trade.
And it's not Adam Smith's free market anymore. It's monopoly maintained how? Through interlocking directorates.
Exactly. Yeah. You look at the boards of the big banks, the mining giants, the industrial firms, and the same names pop up again and again. The source mentions Oppenheimer, Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Hambro, Patino.
The usual suspects.
It reveals this tightly knit, often hidden network that's really pulling the levers on world events, far away from any kind of democratic accountability.
Let's make this concrete. The Oppenheimer Empire. That's a prime example, right? In Southern Africa.
A massive example. Harry Oppenheimer's influence, primarily through the Anglo-American Corporation and De Beers Consolidated Mines, was just immense across South Africa and Central Africa. The scale is hard to comprehend: total integration, finance, extraction, industry.
Anglo-American is called the biggest octopus in that sea. What did they actually control beyond just digging stuff up?
Well, Anglo-American wasn't just a mining company. It acted as the technical manager and secretary for a vast network of other mining, industrial, and investment firms. They controlled everything from operations on the ground right up to the highest financial structuring.
And they were constantly reorganizing.
Constantly. Not just for growth, the source explicitly says, but also to, quote, correct the tax position.
Which tells you the priority is maximizing profit across borders, not necessarily local development or tax contribution.
Precisely. And there was that interesting discovery about uranium.
Ah, yes, turning waste into strategic material.
Exactly. They found they could extract high-grade uranium from the leftover slimes and residues around old gold mines. South Africa quickly became a major world uranium producer thanks to this.
And heavily backed by U.S. capital.
Yes, the Export-Import Bank was involved. It shows how strategic interests getting nuclear material during the Cold War easily overrode any political or ethical concerns about the apartheid regime providing it. Business is business.
Okay, another crucial case study, Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, UMHK. Its role in the Congo tragedy was central.
Absolutely devastating. UMHK's power came from this enormous concession, 7,700 square miles in Katanga province, unbelievably rich in copper, cobalt, uranium. It was practically a state within a state.
And the sheer amount of money flowing out before independence? It's staggering. We should pause on those numbers.
They really are. In just the 5 years before 1960, the net capital outflow from Congo to Belgium was £464 million.
£464 million. How does that compare to, say, the colonial government's budget?
It dwarfed it. In 1 year, UMHK's profits hit £27 million. But in the same period, African purchasing power in the Congo actually decreased by 13%.
So huge wealth generated, none of it staying, and local people getting poorer. That is neo-colonial economics in a nutshell.
It absolutely is. UMHK was so powerful, its uranium output was apparently vital for propping up the entire Belgian economy after World War II.
And they knew how to use their market power, right? The radium price-fixing store.
Yeah, yes. Back in the 20s and 30s, UMHK basically dictated the world price for radium, set it at an astronomical $70,000 a gram, held it there until Canadian competition emerged.
And even then, the new price was still
$20,000 a gram. And the source notes both companies still made huge profits. It just shows the enormous markup built into the system by these monopolies.
So how did they manage this? These cartels like UMHK or the Rhodesian Selection Trust with copper, what tools did they use to control prices?
The main tool was manipulating supply, consciously. The big copper companies, for example, deliberately ran their mines below full capacity for years.
Really? They produced less than they could?
Yes, operating at maybe 80–85% capacity up until mid-1964. This self-imposed restriction created artificial scarcity. They built up huge stockpiles outside the main consuming countries, like the U.S., specifically to keep the price high and stable around $234 per pound a ton at the time.
So they deliberately created waste idle capacity, lost production, just to guarantee high profits. It sounds completely irrational from an efficiency standpoint.
But perfectly rational from a monopoly profit standpoint.
And the other threat they used, synthetics.
Yes, the constant threat of substitution. Using synthetic rubber instead of natural rubber. Using aluminum instead of copper or nickel in some applications. Holding this possibility over the heads of primary producers kept the prices for natural resources depressed.
And the ultimate irony
is that the very same giant corporations, these monopolies controlling the natural resources, often also controlled the production of the synthetics.
So they had it stitched up both ways.
Completely. They could play one off against the other, ensuring developing countries could never get the full market value for their raw materials, never use price fluctuations to fund their own industrial leap. It's a stranglehold.
Okay, so if economic domination is the engine, then political and ideological manipulation is kind of the steering wheel, the guidance system for neocolonialism. We have to look at how things like aid were actually turned into tools of exploitation.
The numbers here are stark. They completely flip the usual narrative about international help. The source cites figures from the early 60s between 1960 and 1962. The so-called aid going to developing countries averaged about $6 billion a year.
Okay, $6 billion in. But what was coming out?
In a single sample year, 1961, the total amount extracted from those same countries was estimated at $11.8 billion.
Nearly double. $11.8 billion out for $6 billion in. How did they get that $11.8 billion figure? What was it made of?
It breaks down into three parts. First, $5 billion in straightforward profits repatriated by foreign companies. Second, $1 billion in interest payments on loans.
Okay, that's $6 billion. Where's the rest?
The biggest chunk, $5.8 billion, came from what the source calls non-equivalent exchange.
Non-equivalent exchange. We need to define that clearly.
It's the idea that the trade itself is structurally unfair. Developing nations are forced, through this whole system we've discussed, to sell their primary products, Things needing lots of labor but little capital at artificially low, often manipulated prices.
While having to buy back.
Manufactured goods, high-value goods from the developed nations at inflated prices. That $5.8 billion represents the estimated value lost through this systematic overcharging for imports and underpaying for exports.
So aid wasn't aid at all. It was just masking a much larger flow of wealth out of the developing world. A modern form of capital export dressed up nicely.
That's precisely the argument. It makes aid look like another tool of exploitation. And this financial control is often cemented by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Multilateral aid.
Which sound neutral, but
they're heavily dominated by Western capital, particularly U.S. capital. And the conditions they impose for loans are incredibly invasive. Borrowers have to submit their entire national economic plans for review.
and accept supervision.
Yes, ongoing supervision over how the loans are used. This gives these external financial bodies immense power to shape or even block a nation's chosen economic path.
So you have this overt economic control via aid conditions, working alongside what the source calls the invisible government in places like the U.S.
Right. Agencies like the CIA, the Pentagon, intelligence outfits operating behind the official diplomatic scenes, often running counter to stated foreign policy.
With the aim of
Achieving, quote, colonialism, in fact, while preaching independence. It's cynical, but that's the described goal. And this leads us into the ideological fight undermining unity, controlling information.
Let's start with labor movements, often the core of anti-colonial organizing. How are they targeted? The ICFDU comes up.
Yes, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. The analysis points out that after the American AFL-CIO gained more control over its board around 1959, huge amounts of money started flowing into Africa.
For what purpose?
Ostensibly for organizing equipment, paying high salaries to local union leaders, sometimes outright bribes. But this activity quickly got the ICFTU linked with the CIA in the eyes of many workers, and it lost credibility.
So they needed a new front, the AALC.
Exactly. The African American Labor Center was set up, presented as a fresh outfit, claiming to be a champion of independence.
But its real goal
was to prevent the rise of strong, unified, politically conscious African labor movements. By funding purely economic strikes just about wages and pushing anti-unity messages, they aimed to keep labor fragmented and distracted from broader national liberation or Pan-African goals, serving imperial interests by keeping things divided.
Okay, then there's the propaganda war. The United States Information Agency, USIA, described as the main weapon in psychological warfare.
Its key objective, according to the source, was crucial: to prevent the growth of independent national media in developing countries, to capture the information space.
Create an information monopoly.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
USIA worked closely with intelligence agencies, with NATO allies, backing pro-Western local media, publishing scores of newspapers and magazines across Africa, Asia, Latin America, all designed to counter narratives promoting genuine self-determination or, especially, unity.
And finally, the more covert influence. Groups disguised as humanitarian or even religious organizations.
Right. Look at the scrutiny surrounding the Peace Corps. Launched with noble ideals, sure. But its first director had CIA ties. Volunteers were FBI screened. Despite rules against it, volunteers were accused of subversion and kicked out of several countries, like Tanzania, Indonesia. It suggests they were seen, at least by some host governments, as part of that invisible government apparatus.
And then there's moral rearmament, MRA. This one's fascinating because of its reach and who supported it. What was their message?
MRA was this global movement started before WWII, when it was actually criticized for appeasing Hitler. Later, it spent fortunes promoting collaboration between what it called oppressing forces, capitalists, colonial powers, and the African people.
Collaboration, not resistance.
Exactly. It preached this philosophy of changing individual morals first, suggesting political change would follow naturally. Basically, a way to dampen radicalism, discourage confrontation with the colonial system. Fix yourself, not the system.
And key figures in the Congo crisis, like Chom and Kasavubu, were MRE supporters.
Public supporters, yes. Which is significant, given they were advocating collaboration precisely with the forces, like Union Miniere, that were benefiting from the fragmentation of the Congo. It shows how deep this ideological penetration could go, influencing leaders at critical moments. So you see the pattern. Neo-colonial control wasn't just brute force or simple economics. It was a sophisticated, multi-pronged strategy targeting policy, labor, media, even the moral outlook of leaders. Divide and rule, updated for a new era, deployed globally. #outro.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the core argument from the source material really comes back into focus. That internal crisis Marx saw coming for capitalism.
The widening gap between rich and poor.
It wasn't solved. It was just postponed, exploited, transferred onto the global stage, creating this international class war.
Exactly. And that structural reality leads to a pretty bleak conclusion in the text. Looking to capitalism itself for a cure, for fairness. It's futile.
Because the system's logic demands exploitation.
When faced with the choice short-term profit through exploitation versus long-term equitable development finance capital driven by its own internal logic, we'll always choose exploitation, no matter how nice the codes of political ethics might sound.
So the solution offered by Nkrumah isn't about appealing to the powerful. It's about building counterpower.
Absolutely. The conclusion is unequivocal. Unity is the first requisite for destroying neo-colonialism.
Unity on multiple levels.
Yes. An all-union government for Africa is presented as the primary need. Strengthening Afro-Asian solidarity, building alliances with Latin American partners. The lesson drawn from defeating direct colonialism is that it only ended when the forces against it were so strong.
That the imperial powers had no other choice.
Exactly. No other alternative was possible. The future depends on creating those kinds of decisive counterpressures against neocolonialism.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on. We've spent this time detailing how global monopoly capital through these interlocking boards, financial networks, consortia, these superstates already operate seamlessly on a Pan-African, even a world scale. They've achieved unity of action in their own interests. So what does it mean for the future of decolonial thought and action that the exploited nations and peoples must first achieve the kind of operational and economic unity that their exploiters have already mastered and perfected?